Ready. Play.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whatever time it is in the world, wherever you're tuning in from. These are some special episodes as we build up to Christmas, but also, of course, the new season. It feels as though the last one has barely finished, but we are here to reflect on 2023 and some of the matches of the year. And I think on the WTA side, it would be extremely negligent to ignore the Australian Open women's final, singles, Rennae, right?
Absolutely. Certainly for me, not necessarily match of the year. I don't know. It's probably up there with match of the year, but we tend to sort of forget about the start of the year when we start talking about matches of the year because we think about all the matches at the US Open or maybe the WTA finals, maybe not the WTA finals because there were no real great matches there. But not thanks to, a lot of wind, let's just be honest. But I think that, when you start reflecting on the year, you forget about the ones that were at the start of the year a little bit. And for me, I just, when you asked me to talk about this, I was like, we can't forget about the Australian Open final. So for me, it was just one of the most intensely played matches from literally first game to last game. It was really very, very, very impressive.
Rennae, I think I would personally put it at the top. I mean, it is all subjective of, all our feelings and stuff, but I was thinking about this quite a bit throughout the year, but even more so in the last few days, that I thought Swiatek against Sabalenka in Madrid was incredible too. I was lucky to be there. I think we had some really good matches at Wimbledon, probably up until the final. The US Open maybe less so. There were some unusual matches like the semi-final, I think, between Keys and Sabalenka, but that was kind of just quirky. Yeah. But for me, as you said, from start to finish, the ball striking, the unerring accuracy of this match, and the magnitude and the story as well, just probably elevates it for me. Yeah,
I think undoubtedly, we know that Rybakina had won Wimbledon the year before, so her going for a second Grand Slam, we were kind of not surprised to see in that final, the way she had been playing from winning Wimbledon right up to the Australian Open final, and certainly you could say she struggled after that. I know she did well in, I believe it was Indian Wells or Miami that she won, but she really struggled with a lot of injuries. So it is a shame because she's such a great player. But that match was her at her very best, in my opinion, coming off, as I said, winning Wimbledon and, being this new face inside the top 10 that was so good and on every level, forehand, backhand, certainly a backhand and serve. And so, when you're sitting there doing commentary, for example, or doing, for me, courtside commentary, I'm always so interested in who I get to commentate, right? And so you kind of sort of, this is better, maybe an inside baseball kind of comments, but you do root for certain people to get better matches. You know what I mean? Like I'm always rooting for maybe the sort of defender / counter puncher against a big hitter. Like, back in the day, you would have a Sabalenka Wozniacki or, even way back in my day, like Monica Seles against Arantxa Sanchez or Steffi against Arantxa Sanchez. So you want that sort of matchup. I love to see that type of Halep versus a big hitter, Wozniacki. So I was a little bit bummed, and I can't remember who was in the semis there. I would have to rack my mind. But I know
Rennae was one of the
oh,
semis.
Lynette, yeah.
The semi was Rybakina against Azarenka, maybe?
Okay, yeah. So I was kind of sort of hoping Azarenka, Sabalenka, or that type of a matchup, just because Azarenka doesn't make a lot of errors, and so you want that sort of matchup because you want to have sort of long rallies, if anything.
Mm-hmm.
So when these two were drawn up against each other, to be honest with you, I thought this is going to be a terrible final. We're not going to have any rallies. This is just going to be bang, bang tennis. It's just going to be boring in a lot of ways. And it was the absolute opposite of what I expected, which was such a delight for me. Sitting there courtside and the palpable pressure on both players, and certainly on Sabalenka being in her first final, going up for her first, possibility of a Grand Slam. So, and I think the underlying people, in the industry anyway, were sort of pulling for her to get a Grand Slam because she's very deserved of it. And the story of her father passing away not that long ago. And so there was a lot of things, hence the reason when she won the match, she, walked to her player's box, but first kissed up to the sky. That was her dad, so we all sort of knew the story. But the tennis itself was just outstanding. You could not leave a ball short in the court, or it was just toast. And that's usually you get a spat of. I was thinking we would get a spat of unforced errors, and this would kind of be a little bit of a one and done, serve +1 and big returns. But they were both hitting the absolute, daylights out of the ball and hitting it in a lot in this match. So, So it was just incredibly accurate, big hitting, and that is just something that you don't see all the time. And like I said, it was from the first game until the very last game that the standard of tennis was just unbelievable. Even the match point, if you go back to the match point, just an unbelievable serve. When we're sitting there all watching it, and I was sitting next to Casey Delacroix and, all the other sideline reporters, we're all sitting in a row, Barbara Shett, as I said, Casey Delacroix, and Laura Robson. So there was 4 of us sitting there, and we were all pulling at that point for Sabalenka to win because we did want her to win, and she'd had a couple match points, and we're like, oh my God, is she going to choke this away? So all of us were sort of sitting there saying, I'm so nervous for her, because we really did want her to win in the end. Nothing against Rybakina. She'd already won a slam, and you sort of, as a competitor, you want to see someone have that joy, right? And so we're all sitting there like, is she going to win this? Is she going to serve it out now? And, she hit that unbelievable serve down the tee, and you thought, oh, that's it, right? No, it came back. I mean, it was such an amazing return, and it was about within a foot of the baseline. This is match point. And Sabalenka's ability to be able to get that ball back in and of itself was unreal, and produces a beautiful, I think it was a backhand. So, and then, eventually the error was made from Rybakina. But like the standard of the hitting was just probably the best match I've seen, and may even say ever, which is a big statement.
It is a big statement, but there, as you say, big hitting from both players. I went into the tournament predicting a title for Sabalenka. I thought she. And you know what? Let's have Aryna Sabalenka as this year's Australian Open champion. I thought she'd, nip and tuck between her and a couple other players, but from the US Open all the way through to January, I think she picked up a title in Adelaide just before the tournament. And throughout that period, I thought she was arguably the best player on the tour. But all that confidence for me drained on the day of the final. And I started to have the doubts. And I started to think about Sabalenka and some of the doubts that she might be having, and so on and so forth. And in fact, I didn't back down on my prediction, but I did have my doubts. Do you know where I'm coming from with that?
Yeah, of course. Listen, the hardest thing to do is something you've never done before, right? And so Sabalenka had never won a Grand Slam. This was a player that she was going up against who can arguably hit her off the court, which is very rare. And the fact that Rybakina had won Wimbledon, so I wouldn't say convincingly, it was in 3 sets over Ons Jabeur, and it wasn't pretty, but you could arguably say that her personality and her calmness is probably going to win this match because she's won a Grand Slam before. And as I said, she can match the serving power and the returning power of Sabalenka. So you would have been okay with the doubts going into the match, just knowing obviously what Rybakina was capable of and not afraid of the big stage, let's face it. So yes, you could arguably say that all the things that could go wrong with Sabalenka probably would. And I'm sure you probably started to feel a little bit more, even more nervous in the first game when she double faulted 2 of her first, I think, 3 serves. So,
Yeah.
but you know, the great thing about her in that moment, and I'll never forget this, was sitting there, as I said, I was courtside, was she started laughing when she hit, I believe, the second double fault. And I think she hit a fault on the first serve and sort of smiled at her group like, oh shit, this is not the way we want to start this match. You know? And you're sort of sitting there going, oh my God, if the yips come back here, this is not going to be pretty. And you know what? She dug herself out of that. I think the first game in so many ways was indicative really of Sabalenka and why she won the tournament in the end and that match, because she started as badly as she possibly could have with the double fault. And then she went ace and I think double faulted again. And you're just like, what Sabalenka, what box of chocolates are we going to get on this serve today? And so I think her hitting out of that first game, serving well, going after her ground strokes and winning that first game was absolutely pivotal for the rest of the match for her. Because I think she could say, if I can get through that game where she's without question at her most nervous as anybody is in the first game serving. And obviously with the debacle of the couple of double faults that she threw in there at the beginning, you thought if she was going to mentally break down and the serve would go off and she wouldn't handle the pressure, that game indicated, I think, to her that she could fight through those nerves, fight through the technical difficulties, win the game, and then get going again. And I think that was one of the most impressive things that I've seen, because we all know, look, having 6 matches under your belt certainly helps. But, you know, we've seen a lot of people get to the final and absolutely freeze and not play well. And so for me, the way she dug herself out of that first game was really indicative of the entire match.
Yeah, but actually that's something that she had to do throughout the match in so many respects, whether it be that first game, whether it be the setback of losing the first set and then being, I think, a couple of break points down or facing a couple of break points at the beginning of the second. And then, of course, as you mentioned as well, trying to serve it out as she did so on her 4th match point. Ironically, the same scenario happened to her in Madrid about 5 months later. And I asked her in the press conference, I said, does that ring any bells to you, 4 match points? And she's like, yes, I was thinking about that. And I was thinking, so this is what she's now saying in Madrid 5 months after she's got over that hump of when it's, and I sort of, you know, dragged it out of her. I was like, you know, did Australia help you in that moment? And she's like, absolutely. Yeah. Because, you know, once you've gone through that, it's like, if I can do it in Australia, I can certainly do it in Madrid. And she did. But yeah, coming back to this match, of course, the doubts that I had were because she's one of these players on tour that we'd seen get close, albeit more in semi-finals than finals of slams, but a sort of a Sakkari, an Ons Jabeur, and you're just wondering that if she's going to win it, it might have to be in a sort of more comfortable way, that she just, you know, is much better than her opponent, and that helps get her through. But she had to do it the hard way.
Yeah, and I think maybe in some respects it was easier for her to have it be the hard way, knowing that, you know, when she stepped up to the line, and sometimes you sort of play you play not all the time, but you play sometimes to the standard of your opponent. If your opponent starts out playing horribly, sometimes it just transfers over to you and you just start really badly as well. And, you know, even though Rybakina had won Wimbledon and she had all that experience, it's still only her 2nd Grand Slam final as well. And it's a different atmosphere in Australia. It's, you know, the crowd, to tell you the one thing was really obvious too, the crowd were loving it, because you didn't know who they wanted to win in the end, because it was just such good tennis from both players. And I think, you know, the Australian public, the tennis public in particular, are very, very knowledgeable in their sports and obviously very knowledgeable with tennis. And so it was like just such this beautiful balance. And I hadn't heard that in a while, because really the public didn't really know these two very well. You know, in one of the last times that I remember sitting next in courtside and watching Sabalenka's when she lost in a tough match to Ash Barty, and the crowd were brutal on her. They were brutal on the grunting and, you know, making fun of her. And this was years before. This was when she was about 19 years of age. Mm-hmm. And she didn't handle that moment very well. But boy, I tell you what, like 3 or 4 years later, when she comes back and wins the tournament, I think because when she started out playing the match and as I said, double folded, hit a couple of aces, got out of the game, sort of smiled and was like, oh, thank God. And then Rybakina went down the other end of the court and went, I think, first serve, bang down the tee ace. And I was like, oh my God, this is like a dude's match with serving. They are just going to pummel each other's serves. They're going to go after the returns. And I think they both straight away after the first two games, if you go back to those two games, it was, I remember sitting there and I remember sitting back and looking at my fellow co-commentators and just being like, holy shit, we are in for a match tonight, because you could just tell that they both came to play. They both were going to serve well. They were both going to hit the ball really well. They were the early nerves were kind of gone, and we just knew it was going to be one of those matches of serving and attacking. And if you dropped your level that much, you were going to lose that night. And their levels never dropped the whole match. It was unbelievable. It was one of, as I said, and that's why I wanted to talk about it. It was one of the most highly, best played matches that I had seen in a long time from two really big hitters.
I remember a picture from Bastian on Twitter about 2 days before the final, or when the semi-finals were done and therefore the final was set. And it was a picture of a tennis ball. And it was like, this is how the ball's going to look on Saturday, because it was just obviously a tennis ball in a bad condition, let's say. And I remember thinking, but of course, as you said, Rennae, I hadn't really thought about this. Of course, it can go one of two ways. You can have one person, particularly, perhaps Sabalenka, crumbles under the pressure, but you can also have a sort of a matchup that doesn't quite produce the fireworks that we hope or whatever, because, as you say, often contrasts help a tennis match so much. But in the end, it did deliver, and it delivered for all the reasons that we'd said. Before the final as well, though, to be fair, Sabalenka had I don't want to give any disrespect to any of her opponents, but certainly in terms of ranking, it had a softer run. I think she had a key match against maybe Bencic en route, but that was kind of the only one that stood out as a tricky one. I mean, Magdalena, is a lower ranked player that to play in a Grand Slam semi-final, not so bad. Rybakina, on the other side, had to come through, former finalist Daniel Connelly's in a really good match early on, I think about the third round. Then, of course, she had to come through Swiatek as well, and a former winner in Azarenka. That I also thought that was another reason I was sort of changing my mind, because I thought she's battle hardened, and I thought that might come into play as well.
Yeah, you could say that, but every time I say that, it doesn't work out. I mean, I think about two people in general that that happen to. There's a list of players that you could say that about, but I think about like Sam Stosur when she lost to Schiavone in the finals of the French back in 2010. I mean, she beat everybody in that tournament. She beat Henin, who was 3-time champion at the French. She beat Serena. She beat Jankovic. Like, she beat everybody in that tournament, and then lost to somebody that I don't think had ever lost to, or never lost to again in the finals against Schiavone, because that's just the way it happens, And I think about Leylah Fernandez at the US Open, who beat everybody to get to the finals there, and then lost to Emma Raducanu, who arguably you could say hadn't really beaten the players and caliber of players that that Leylah had beaten, but she had gone through quali, so that kind of counts. But I think sometimes you do get to the final, you are battle tested, but the other person might be a bit fresher and might feel really comfortable and really good because they have smashed everybody that they've played going into the final. So I don't think it matters in some ways. In some ways, like, I can just remember, like, if I've beaten a lot of really good teams to get to a final of a Grand Slam, I'm not thinking about who I've beaten. I'm not thinking about how well I've played to get there. I'm just thinking, all I care about is wanting to win the final. And so it doesn't really matter who you beat going into a final. It's just how you feel in that final. And it's how you feel about your tennis. And I would say that Sabalenka, probably having won Adelaide as well. Yeah. So, I mean, when you've won Adelaide and now you're in the finals of the Australian Open, you feel really good about your tennis. And for someone who hits the ball big and, needs her serve working, which it clearly was, everything else is just going to fit into place. And her forehand was great as well, which is usually her shot that goes off. I think she had improved her technique on her forehand. And so the little things that could go off under pressure were not going off under pressure. There was never a crack in the armor. Like, even when we were thinking she's going to double fault here, and she didn't. And it was just like, oh, she's got it today, and Rybakina, same thing. She's got it today. So that's why we knew early on. I remember sitting back really honestly, like, I think even 2-1 or 1-1 in the first set, just going, oh, this is going to be really good. And I can be honest in saying I never thought I could say that about those two playing. each
The
other.
the atmosphere in the stadium, I mean, obviously, didn't have an Aussie like the year before with Ash Barty and maybe a legend of the game such as a Serena or a Venus in the final to pull for. Did you get a sense that because Sabalenka hadn't won a slam at that point that she did have a bit more support, or because maybe the match was going one way or the other that the crowd will often pull for the sort of person who's behind?
Yeah, I think this is one of the matches where I really think that they weren't pulling for either player. They were really just, the crowd was so evenly balanced and comparative, obviously, to the year before with Ash and Danielle Collins, where it was like Danielle Collins would play a great point, hit a winner. It was like crickets. And
Yeah.
Ash would win a point. It would be like, I've never heard the stadium ever so loud in my life. So I think it was nice to hear that real balance. It was really, truly a balance. Like the crowd were, excited about, pulling for whoever lost the first set. Clearly they wanted 3 sets. And then in the third set, they were just pulling for great tennis. Even to I think maybe at the very end, they were pulling for Sabalenka because I think they felt like, okay, we kind of, I don't know. I think they felt that Sabalenka I think they got a little bit more behind Sabalenka towards the end. There's no question. But honestly, it was one of the most well-matched matches I've ever seen with the matchup and with the crowd.
To sort of just paint a picture for those tuning in, to sort of, maybe they don't remember the match or they just sort of forgot parts of it, and even I had to sort of refresh my memories. We did have those 2 first service games that you highlighted from both players, where Sabalenka was a bit nervy, maybe with a double fault in the opener, but then she settled and held serve, and then Rybakina holds. But actually, it's Rybakina who draws first blood by breaking Sabalenka, and Sabalenka was up 40-love on her serve, which makes it probably even more painful. But that's the other thing that actually happened, is actually there were breaks of serve in this match. We sometimes talk about, I remember a couple of matches at the WTA finals in Texas in 2022, the one that was indoors and didn't have quite so much wind, and there were some really high quality matches there, but it was actually high quality with service holds. Here we had an incredible level of serving with the odd double fault from Aryna, but still we were getting breaks of serve. And in that first set, we had 3, and the decisive one went the way of Rybakina, as I mentioned. Sabalenka then has to hold serve in a sticky scenario at the beginning of the second set, so 15-40, and you just think she gets one of those points wrong, but she kept her nerve in that game at the beginning of the second set of 15-40. And that's the thing, that maybe, does it help at all if you've got this kind of mindset that I'm going to play aggressively and I'm going to try and take the opportunity at every point? Does that help the nerves a bit in these moments, that you don't need to doubt yourself? Does that make sense?
No, I mean, you can look at it like obviously somebody who is a risk taker coming into the net, or someone who goes after the ball. I mean, look, these two they're not a Swiatek or a Coco Gauff style mover, right? So you've got to take advantage of the short ball as soon as you can. And as I said earlier at the start, I think the thing that was key is that if anything was short, it was gone. Like the accuracy of their hitting, and I'm talking short as in close to the service line, it was gone. So if you didn't get it close to the baseline, you were losing the point. And there was no errors, and sometimes when you play against big hitters like that, they do make a lot of errors. They'll make one here, they'll make one there, but not in this final. They were just both so accurate with their shot making and hitting. They were hitting like this close to the line every single time. So if you didn't hit it really well, you were losing the point. And there was a very rare time where it was an average point or an average shot that was not punished. And so for me, yes, if you didn't serve well as well, and including second serve that wasn't accurate, it was getting punished. So sometimes it's just like, oh my God, that serve was so bad, it should have been killed. But they weren't bad serves either, but they were still getting crushed because they were the shortest shot that they were going to see in the rally. So that's the thing that impressed me the most, just the depth of their shots and the accuracy of the depth of their shots, and the width, obviously, close to the sideline. So it was just, everything was just at the highest of levels. It was, as I said, one of the most impressive matches I've ever watched.
I think at least the stats I have up here, 51 winners off the racket, Sabalenka, to 28 unforced errors. And as you said, having to take so many risks because otherwise you would get punished for it. Actually, 28 unforced errors across 3 sets and around 3.5 hours, or 3 hours, I should say, is mightily impressive, actually, especially the way she plays. So she goes on to win the second set. She gets up. She actually responds to saving those break points, Sabalenka, and actually gets a break of her own. And in fact, it was kind of Rybakina that was hanging on to try and just keep it at 1 break of serve in that second set. The third set was a much tighter affair until Sabalenka gets a very important break, I think, at around about midway through that set. So she still has to hang on a little bit. Now, my question to you is, you've had a lot of success in doubles. You know what it's like to play in these big environments and big arenas and have pressure moments. Are the butterflies in your stomach as much as they are in mine when I'm just on my couch watching on TV? I mean, what's it like? I mean, in doubles, of course, you've got a bit of responsibility in terms of your partner. I don't really know how that dynamic plays out, but also, of course, you have singles experience too. Just talk to us about those tense moments and yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously, as you said and pointed out, she got that, mid-set break. And so you're like, okay, in some respects, getting a break early in a set is a burden in some respects because you have to keep holding serve. But the mental way of looking at that and the right way of looking at it, and why people become champions, is that they get the break, but they treat it like a game that's just a game. And then you get on to concentrating on your next service game yourself and winning the game. And, and that sort of similar thing happened to, Lisa, Raymond and I. We got an early-ish break in the finals of the Australian Open. And it's basically, you feel like you're, as the pundits will say, hanging on to that break or, consolidating that break. But the bottom line is you want to win the tournament. And so to win the tournament, you've got to be up and you've got to be ahead. So you have that early break. And so the most important thing is to stay present. And that's it. And that's whether it's 3-3 or 4-2, you have to stay in the moment, right? You have to stay in the moment of holding your own serves. And so, when you get an early break, you just concentrate on take care of your own business, take care of your own service game. And that's what Sabalenka did. And she had to fight, in concluding the last game. I mean, that game was one of the most tense and crazy, emotional games. And again, the quality of tennis was so good. And Rybakina was not going anywhere, even though the Sabalenka was, in control of the match based on the fact that she had the break and was serving well. Rybakina was not giving up. And Rybakina was saying, if you don't serve well, I'm going to crush every return and I'm going to break you back. So I think in some respects, because of the tennis quality and because Sabalenka knew that she couldn't drop her guard at all in any way down 5%, she dropped her play 5%, she was done. And you know that. So when you're in what I said earlier, when you play to your opponent's skill level that day, if they're playing really well, you often play really well back because you have no respite. You cannot drop focus for 1 second because you will lose. So I think in some respects, it actually probably helped Sabalenka that the quality of tennis from Rybakina was so good that she had to stay fully focused in the moment. So I think the bottom line is when you're out there, you think about it, but the overall thing to never do is to think ahead. You have to stay in the present. And I think that Sabalenka did that really, really well, considering she got that break early-ish in the set. But she was just fantastic holding on to her own serve. And the last game was indicative really of the match.
Yeah, it was. I was thinking that as you were reminding me of that last game, that it did kind of encapsulate the match and the reason why, it's so highly thought of. That she had 4 championship points, but that barely tells the story. She double faulted on the first one. She hit this Aryna. She puts a forehand wide on the second. Then I think Rybakina gets a break point, only for Sabalenka to, of course, save it on a first serve. And then finally on the fourth one, as I said, that she did get it after Rybakina goes long. And I think she falls to the ground, as we see so often. But this felt like an even more significant moment just because of what we'd seen with Aryna. And now we're sort of take a broader look at it in a way of what we'd seen. If you remember, I think it was, well, I'm sure you remember the previous year, all the way up until her match with Kai Kanepi, it was for me, although I think Aryna would say that she was actually coming through those service yips by then. But I remember that third round against Kai Kanepi, where she was on the ropes, and I think she had to save a couple of match points in that third round. And you can imagine if she goes out in the third round at the US Open, you know, it would be like she's on a sort of a downward trend, especially compared looking at the year as a whole. We mentioned all the double faults from Australia all the way through until about the US Open. And we were just like, she's so talented. She's so good. But we've seen many players that are talented and excellent, but they can't quite get there. So when she falls to the ground, I mean, I guess there was an outpouring of emotion. I mean, you said that yourself that you couldn't help but pull for her. And I don't know, I was delighted for her and delighted for tennis.
Yeah, as I said, I mean, Laura Robson, Casey Delacroix, Barbara Shett, all former, really good players in their own right. We were sitting there watching this match, and we were all very nervous for her. We all looked at each other and we said, "Do you think she can serve it out?" And we're all like, "I think so." No, but we all felt for her at that moment. But also, when you're out there, it's very different to watching. When you're out there, you're fully focused. You're fully, if you want to win, staying in the present.
Is it easier to be on the court, Rennae, than watch?
Well, yeah, it's easier to play just because you're in control of what's happening. So if you feel really good about yourself, you know that you're probably going to close it out. But, when you're sitting and watching, you have no idea what's going on in your player's mind. You have no control over anything except just sitting there. So it is much harder watching. But when you're out there too, it's clearly not easy to control yourself, control your emotions. And for somebody who is very, very emotional in Sabalenka, I thought that she handled that last game really well, because it was not easy. And even as I said, the match point she won was probably the best that Rybakina had played. The point. I mean, she couldn't have hit that return back any better off of one of the best serves, because Sabalenka had not served well on her match points. She had double faulted, as you said, and I think she missed the first serve every single time. And this time she hits a perfect serve down the tee to the weaker shot of Rybakina, and Rybakina smashed it back within a foot of the baseline. So it's like, that last point was indicative of the match in a lot of respects, because it was just the best against the best. And then, if anything, Rybakina's forehand is probably the weakest shot on the court, missed on match point. So it's kind of perfect the way it, I guess, went down, and that Sabalenka was able to win. But yeah, when she fell to the ground, you could just see her and start absolutely bawling. And I as a player know that feeling, like you just finally can let it all out. You can finally let all your emotions out. And that's why you see players cry when they win, or, like Coco did when she won the US Open. It's like, you can finally be yourself. You can finally let go of all the walls that are up and protecting you on the tennis court, to not think about the possibility of losing. And that's why you always hear the greats say, stay in the moment, stay in the moment. Well, that's finally the first time where you don't have to stay in the moment. The moment is you're allowed to be really happy. And so that moment, to me, watching her fall to the ground and just go into absolute tears was, really great to see.
One more about both players, and that is that, I remember speaking to Caitlin Thompson a couple of days after the final, and both of us were sort of quite confident in Aryna with the shackles off, in terms of her, the pressure of having to win a slam obviously was on her back, but now that was gone. But sometimes we see it with players, perhaps with Dominic Thiem, one or two others, where they get over that line and then they relax. But neither of us could quite envisage that with Aryna, that we probably now get the best version of her. And I know she's not won another slam since, but I think she had a remarkable year, and probably only slightly eclipsed by Iga at the end. And then with Elena as well, obviously both of them have won Grand Slam. Elena had a few injury travails. She'd win a clay 1000, of course, in Rome. And I think you touched on it as well, winning in Indian Wells against Aryna. Both of these players, they're going to be multiple slam winners, aren't they?
Yeah,
they're going to win one more each.
Yeah, I would suspect so. But look, we never know what happens with injuries. You don't know what happens with someone's emotional state. It's not easy. Winning a Grand Slam is not easy. It's winning 7 matches in a row against the best players in the world. So, clearly, I think the only lock when it comes to winning a Grand Slam again is probably Iga winning the French Open. So, don't know. I suspect that they will win another Grand Slam. They're both very young. They're both in their mid-20s. So the possibility of them winning the Australian Open, coming up in January is very good. It's always good to go back to a place that you have success. And I think Sabalenka will probably go in and maybe slight favorite, or, equal favorite with Iga, even though Iga's absolute Iga's my favourite to win the tournament, but she's also never made the finals of the Australian Open. The court can play quite quick. It'll depend on the speed of the court. But a Sabalenka or Rybakina at their very best always gives trouble to Iga because of the fast court and the ball striking. But I think Iga also learned a tremendous amount about herself this year too, with the disappointments and up and down. And I think she's probably going to be the player to beat in 2024 again. But having said that, look, I absolutely would not be surprised to see Sabalenka and Rybakina being in a final again in Australia.
Rennae, big thanks. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe and all that jazz. Check out Rennae both on social media, but also on her podcast. The name of your podcast, Rennae?
It's really easy. The Rennae Stubbs Tennis Podcast.
There we go. Wonderful. Thanks, Rennae.